June 4, 1943. Mexia, Texas. The train was advancing silently across the night plains when Oberleutnant Radke, a veteran of the North African campaign, pressed his face against the glass. Outside, a constellation of electric poles illuminated streets, farms, shop windows, and balconies, in the midst of war rationing. In Germany, even Berlin went dark after sunset. In the manuals of Nazi doctrine, that was impossible. And yet, it was before his eyes. What German officials called a decadent empire of Jews and blacks would soon reveal its true nature. The greatest industrial power the modern world had seen. A force that didn't need to scream to dominate. It just worked. From that moment on, the Reich would not only face Allied armies. It would face air-conditioned trains, factories that did not stop, meat served in excess, and engines that never turned off. This documentary will expose in detail the psychological, technical, and ideological impact of the arrival of German prisoners of war in the United States, not because of what they were told, but because of what they saw. The collapse of the Third Reich would begin not with a bomb but with a light switch. But before we dive into the accounts, there's one statistic that defines the whole story. In 1943, while the entire Reich struggled to produce 1 million tons of steel a year, a single American mill, Republic Steel in Ohio, generated 10,000 tons a day. 10,000. Every day. What those prisoners found when they set foot in the United States was not a collapsing nation, but an industrial colossus that turned energy into results, with a precision that no propaganda predicted. They saw tractors worth more than the life of a battalion, witnessed planes being assembled in less than an hour, and watched women and civilians command production lines capable of feeding and arming continents. If you value history made with research, facts, and respect for memory, leave your like and subscribe. This helps us continue to reveal what really happened behind enemy lines, because what these soldiers saw, few would believe. The crossing of the Atlantic took just over 2 weeks, but the quiet transformation of the German prisoners had already begun well before they landed. They arrived in Norfolk, Virginia, under the weight of defeat, but still packed with years of propaganda. They expected retaliation, misery, a country exhausted by 2 war fronts. What they found was something else. On the morning of August 2, 1943, the first group quietly descended on Norfolk Naval Base. Decorated soldiers of the Afrika Korps, general staff officers, and Reich engineers passed by the platform as bewildered tourists. On the horizon, rows of cranes operated relentlessly. The air smelled of clean coal and moving metal. Wagons glided along the tracks with timed precision. Each dock looked like an orchestra in industrial rhythm. The base alone handled more cargo per day than the entire port of Hamburg in a week. Officers noticed the parking lots filled with them, not of military vehicles but of civilian automobiles. Ordinary workers came by car. Men in white t-shirts and lunchboxes under their arms operated machinery that would require entire platoons in the Reich. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "They walk as masters of their land without fear, as if they had infinite time and resources." Unlike the freight cars that transported German soldiers across Europe, the famous 40 and 8, 40 men or 8 horses, Americans used passenger trains with padded seats and dining cars to transport even their captured enemies. The Pullmans had bunk beds, clean towels, air conditioning. A sergeant apologized because the air did not work properly in one of the cars. They apologized for a luxury train, noted a Prussian lieutenant. In Germany, that would be a general's personal train. But it was on the invisible scale that the real abyss began to open. While the Reich maintained its rhetoric of Germanic efficiency, American efficiency revealed itself without fanfare, in operational detail. Each prisoner was given a registration number, photographed, vaccinated, evaluated by trained military doctors, all in less than 48 hours. No queue dragged on. No clipboard was missing. It was an industrialized process of human control, not by oppression, but by planning. One of the officers wrote, "They sued us as if we were entering an organized enterprise, not a prison camp." That was it. Organization, planning, order without brutality, efficiency without fear. The first impact was not physical, it was psychological. Germans were conditioned to believe that the United States was a racial, morally weak, logistically amateur patchwork. But the scene they saw in Norfolk did not correspond to any of this. The base was clean. The operation was silent. The machine did not stop, and no one screamed. It was then that a piece of data circulated among the prisoners like a dangerous whisper. In 1943 alone, the Kaiser shipyards in California produced more than 140 Liberty ships, at a rate of 3 a day, one ship every 8 hours, with abundant food, salaries paid on time, and no slave labor. For comparison, Germany produced about 1,150 ships in the entire war, many of them at the expense of prisoners, makeshift wood, and repurposed parts. If this data surprised you, write in the comments. Logistics wins. That was the first wound in ideology. They weren't seeing an exception. They were seeing the pattern. American logistics was not a makeshift war effort. It was the normal way a production-oriented society operates. Every wagon, every container, every crane operated in sync with the next. And everything turned with abundant electricity, without the smell of burning coal, without the darkness of blackouts that had plunged Germany into silence since 1940. In the accounts gathered years later, historians noted a linguistic pattern in the prisoners' letters. They did not say "we are captives" or "we are imprisoned." They said, "we are watching." The initial distrust gave way to curiosity. The more educated began to ask questions of the guards. How did the base operate? How many ships passed through there? How did they manage to maintain this pace with 2 war fronts? One of them asked how many power plants supplied the system. The guard replied, 7 only here in the region. The silence was absolute. America did not hide its power. She displayed it naturally. That was what baffled them the most. The Germans were trained to believe that power came from fear and brute force. But there, power manifested itself in fluidity, abundance, normality. By the end of the first week, doubt had become an existential dilemma. If the United States treated even prisoners with this efficiency and dignity, how would they treat their own soldiers? And more, if this was the structure set up to manage captives, what would the structure be like to win the war? The answer would not come with words. It would come with steel, concrete, and electricity. Because at the next stop on the train, what the prisoners would see from the windows would not be a military base. It would be the beating heart of a country that decided to turn war into engineering. Still in Norfolk, even before being assigned to the camps in the interior, the German prisoners were subjected to a logistical process that would set the new standard of military efficiency in their minds. The procedure began with landing, followed by medical screening, issuance of photographic IDs, dental inspections, vaccinations, and individual interviews, all carried out with a fluidity that German officials could not associate with a democratic system. In a single day, more than 3,000 men were prosecuted, with no uproar, no delay, no loud voices. In Germany, this same procedure, even among officials, would take weeks, require duplicate paperwork, and often political favors. There in the USA, prisoners watched what seemed to be human cogs lubricated by a system that did not require fear to function. American doctors examined wounds of Axis soldiers with the same attention given to their own men. Officers spoke fluent German, instructed not only in language but in culture, history, even Prussian humor. Each prisoner was accurately recorded, with data that would be sent to offices in Texas, Illinois, and Washington. Medical records, updated daily, were archived and cross-referenced with military databases. For many Germans, this degree of organization was only possible, theoretically, with slave labor, strict military discipline, and exemplary punishment. None of these conditions were present. The base operated with civilians, young auxiliaries, and ordinary soldiers, operating with a tranquility that belied the Nazi logic. A recurring phrase in dozens of letters was, "They are not in a hurry, but everything happens." This fluidity, this clock without screams, was what disarmed them the most. A Luftwaffe officer noted, "They don't produce orders, they produce systems." In a post-war interview, Lieutenant Friedrich Heydrich compared the two models. "We valued the command. They valued flow." The Reich bureaucracy, centralized, opaque, and ideological, blocked even simple actions, such as the distribution of food or clothing. The Americans, on the other hand, operated with distributed redundancy. Camps received orders directly from the barracks, but they also had the autonomy to solve problems in real time. While German officials needed authorization to move a transport unit between cities, the Americans reacted in a matter of minutes to any logistical deviation. Nothing was perfect, but everything was functional. The greatest technical humiliation came not with guns, but with paperclips and timetables met. Even the design of the documents was impressive. The Germans, accustomed to stamps, seals, signatures, and reverence for printed paper as a symbol of authority, saw in the Americans simple, colorful, clear forms, designed to be understood, not revered. The intelligence was in the design, and efficiency in repetition. One medical major wrote, "They replaced hierarchy with checklist. Instead of heroism, they had manuals. Instead of improvisation, standardization." And that's what worked. The American administration not only complied with the Geneva Convention, it surpassed it in every detail. The prisoners were fed the same rations as American soldiers. They had access to dental care, spiritual assistance, space for physical activities, regular mail, and, in many cases, radio and library. All this while Germany rationed paper, cut off gas supplies in smaller cities, and lost civilian doctors to the front lines. The irony did not go unnoticed. Prisoners who had mocked the liberal weaknesses were now given more dignity at the hands of the enemy than in their own field hospitals. And they hadn't seen anything yet. When the trains left Norfolk for the countryside, transporting prisoners to camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska, they had no idea that they were about to witness something even more devastating to National Socialist pride. The continual demonstration, in every mile traveled, that American efficiency was not punctual, it was systemic. At that time, while the Reich was producing V-1 bombs in tunnels dug by prisoners of war and assembling tanks in makeshift hangars in occupied Poland, the Americans were already operating night factories with rotating shifts, optimized assembly lines, and railroad logistics that delivered troops food, steel, and fuel with decimal precision. A German sergeant, looking at a timesheet at a station, wrote, "They treat time as a resource. We treat it like a burden." It was this contrast between the myth of German efficiency and the reality of American functioning that gradually undermined not only the belief in victory, but the very idea of the Reich's cultural superiority. And the train's next stop, with its silent carriages cutting through the southern fields, would reveal that even electricity, a luxury good in bombed-out Europe, was treated as a basic right in America. They were about to discover that in the enemy country the lights wouldn't go out. For many of the captured German soldiers, the first sense of defeat came not from seeing their weapons confiscated, nor from stepping on enemy soil in handcuffs. It came when he opened the lid of a metal tray in a Texas prison camp and found steaming a plate of roasted meat, fresh vegetables, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. Food, hot, plentiful, served by smiling civilians. In the first days, there was silence. Then, perplexity, and finally, shame. The doctrine that formed them said that the American people lived under liberal chaos, dominated by Jews and mobsters, sunk in spiritual and material misery. But there, in the Texas desert, the food seemed to sprout from the ground. 2 days later, they saw the unthinkable: trays being discarded with food intact, remains of meat, rice, and bread being thrown away. One prisoner wrote, "If we did that in Berlin, we would be shot." For the officers, it was a quiet humiliation. The scarcity that dominated Europe had become normal. In the U.S., rationing was not a sign of deprivation, but of distribution. Each camp received weekly batches of fruit, eggs, milk, flour, and canned goods, all produced by mechanized farms and shipped over a railroad network that knew no interruptions. The irony was sharp. While Germany deported starving civilians to make way for weapons production, the Americans fed even their enemies. In many camps, prisoners could choose between different types of bread. White bread, once a symbol of luxury in Europe, was served as standard. Fresh milk was delivered in glass bottles, with cardboard lids, as if the countryside were in the center of a peaceful city. And there was more: breakfast with scrambled eggs, oatmeal, and jam, red meat twice a day, fish on Fridays. Meals followed caloric standards set by the War Department, with nutritional recommendations calculated by civilian nutritionists. The enemy was fed like an American worker. The prisoners' indignation soon turned to introspection. What German propaganda called the nation of weak gluttons revealed a food chain capable of sustaining a continent at war, supplying fleets, maintaining domestic consumption, and even feeding its enemies with leftovers. Food production in the United States in 1943 exceeded 127 million metric tons, nearly triple the combined agricultural output of Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. The state of Iowa alone produced more corn than the entire Soviet Union that year. This abundance was a direct result of an industrialized model, with intensive use of tractors, fertilizers, and cooperative networks. Germany, trapped in the ideology of agrarian purity and the nostalgia of the German peasantry, had refused large-scale mechanization. Nazi propaganda exalted the soil, the hoe, the sweat. Meanwhile, the United States delivered processed food on conveyors, canned with vacuum sealing technology, refrigerated transport and storage in automated silos. It was the victory of technique over rhetoric. The prisoners began to realize that American abundance was not chance, but engineering. A Bavarian soldier reported in a letter, "They do not pray for crops, they build them." For many, the comparison was painful. They had spent the last few years hearing that the moral superiority of the Reich would compensate for any technical limitations. But there, at the bottom of a field in Texas, the scales were upsided. Morality seemed to come exactly from abundance, from the ability to treat even the enemy with dignity, a narrative that the Reich could no longer sustain. And then came the final impact. A group of prisoners working in the kitchen under surveillance discovered that the food they discarded was picked up by trucks and turned into pig feed on nearby farms. Nothing was wasted. Even waste was functional. Germany, plunged into penury, could not feed its own children. The U.S. fed even its pigs what Germany considered luxury. This finding, noted in several reports, caused a dense silence in the lodgings that week. There was no more room for ideological bravado. The enemy had ceased to be just stronger. It was more competent, more predictable, more stable. The scarcity that the Reich said was universal was localized. It wasn't the world's fault. It was a political choice. And as the prisoners digested this bitter reality, a new image loomed on the horizon. Still inside the trains that crossed the countryside, they saw in the distance metal structures that looked like they came out of a science fiction movie. Towers, pipes, steel columns. They were not refineries. They were food production plants, centers that processed wheat, milk, meat, and vegetables on an industrial scale. Entire cities could be supplied by a single facility. The next stop on the train would take the prisoners to these factories. And there, for the first time, they would understand that the real weapon of the United States was not the B-17 bomber. It was the factory that supplied the crew with coffee, flour, and morale. When the first groups of prisoners were relocated to the camps in the interior, many embarked unaware that they were aboard one of the greatest ironies of the war, the Liberty ships. Called ships made to last a single crossing, they were actually made to last just long enough, and that enough was more than the Reich could sustain. The SS John W. Brown, for example, one of the standard models, was built in just 5 working days. 5 days. More than 250,000 pieces produced in 32 different states arrived on time, fit together with precision, and formed, at the end of the wake, a ship with a capacity of 10,000 tons, a full crew and oceanic autonomy. It was a floating production line. To the captured German engineers, this was an insult to industrial logic. Accustomed to artisanal engineering, exclusive projects, the obsessive perfectionism of Reich industry, seeing ships appearing as if they were passenger cars was a shock. A lieutenant in the Kriegsmarine noted, "They didn't build ships, they printed it. The Liberties were not pretty, nor sophisticated, but they worked, and there were many." By 1943, the United States was launching 3 a day. That meant 90 per month, 1,000 per year. Each vessel was another nail in the logistical coffin of the Axis. One of the prisoners asked an American sailor if they were being transported on escort ships reserved for high-value prisoners. The answer was simple. No, that's all that's left today. Leftovers. For the Germans, this was inconceivable. The Reich struggled to build Type 7 submarines with exhausted workmen, rationed materials, and internal sabotage. Americans, by contrast, set up their ships with double shifts, heated cafes, and radios playing jazz on the docks. The German naval industry produced, throughout the war, about 200 submarines and 200 surface ships. America, with Liberty alone, exceeded 2,700 units by 1945, more than the entire fleet of the Kriegsmarine. And that's not counting the Victory freighters, the T-2 tankers, the troop transports, and the escort aircraft carriers. The American strategy was not just to win battles, it was to clog the Atlantic with supplies until it suffocated the enemy. And it worked. The Liberty, with its rectangular, slow, and sparsely armed shape, became a symbol of a new kind of war, the war of production, the war of mathematics, the war won not with the heaviest cannon, but with the most stable spreadsheet. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them all along. The Germans bet on unique pieces, on miraculous weapons, on genius. Americans bet on standardized screws and well-paid workers, and they won. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and want to support this kind of historical and in-depth content, enjoy this video and subscribe. This helps us to continue bringing to light stories that have been buried under the weight of propaganda. Because while the prisoners watched the sea swallow another Liberty launched, they knew that it was not a spectacle. It was routine. American engineering didn't need to impress. I just had to deliver. And the next delivery, to the despair of the Germans, would be even more devastating. A factory where a complete bomber was produced every 63 minutes. As they left the East Coast for the interior of the United States, German prisoners boarded Pullman wagons, originally designed to transport high-class civilian passengers. Each cabin had reclining beds, freshly laundered white towels, air circulating through automatic ventilation systems, and meals served on simple but clean porcelain tableware. Along the corridors, uniformed employees served tea, distributed newspapers, and indicated the times of the stops. It was not staging. It was the routine of a railroad system that operated on a continental scale, with punctuality, safety, and comfort, including for the captured enemy. To those men, trained in the doctrine of sacrifice and scarcity, this was a moral provocation. For years, the Wehrmacht transported its troops in the notorious 40 and 8 wagons, designed for 40 men or 8 horses, with no ventilation, no hygiene, no honor. Officers and soldiers share space with animals and ammunition, squeezed for days on precarious routes between Berlin and the Russian front. Now, as prisoners, they traveled with dignity, and they began to ask themselves, why? The question was repeated in the silent glances exchanged in the booths. One of them, engineer Hans Keller, wrote in his diary, "This is not a prison camp. It's a mirror." Comfort was more than logistics. It was a message. And that message was clear. America could win with dignity. The tracks on which the Pullman wagons slid cut 3,500 kilometers of American territory, uninterruptedly, supplied by hundreds of maintenance stations, electrical grids, coal depots, and support crews. The system operated with redundancy, with reserve locomotives and timetables synchronized by radio. The trains did not stop for lack of parts. They stopped for a crew change. And, contrary to what the Germans expected, there was no queue. There was no chaos. The American infrastructure showed its power precisely in what was invisible, the absence of flaws. Every little efficiency, a clean bed, a hot meal, a lighted station, was a blow to the pride of men trained to see the world through the lens of German superiority. One prisoner noted, "I never imagined that the enemy would take me to a more comfortable bed than the one I had in the Düren barracks." In Germany, comfort was the privilege of officers or party members. In the United States, it seemed to be a state policy, even for captives. This generated not only astonishment but embarrassment. The comparison became inevitable. It was not global scarcity. It was an internal choice. The Reich had decided to impose sacrifice, not because it was necessary but because it was doctrinal. The United States, on the contrary, showed that it was possible to maintain an armed and functioning society without sacrificing dignity. The prisoners silently realized that they were being treated more humanely by their captors than by their own generals. The result was a gradual psychological breakdown. The system that had always told them that the world was cruel, that the enemies were barbarians, that the liberal West was synonymous with decadence. Now he took them around the country in air-conditioned trains, with curtains on the windows and toilet paper folded in a triangle. American logistics didn't just work. It worked elegantly. It was paradoxically a polite war. At a stop in Kansas, a group of civilians looked curiously at the prisoners at the window. A boy waved. One of the Germans looked away, embarrassed. Another responded with a restrained gesture. There, between rails and silence, something had changed. Propaganda had found its antithesis, and it came in the form of kindness. In the camps that would follow, prisoners would have access to classes, radio programs, and even discussion groups. But even before that, in the constant swing of the tracks, they already knew. The enemy was not what they had been taught, and the next stop would take them to the productive heart of the country, where not only men but also machines worked at a pace that Germany could never achieve. By nightfall, already in the Texas camps, the German prisoners began to perceive a pattern that no military doctrine had prepared them to interpret. The lights. They did not go out, not even with sirens, nor with orders, nor afraid. They remained lit in the barracks, in the watchtowers, on the back roads, in the surrounding villages, and, most disturbingly, in completely empty buildings. A rural school 2 kilometers from the countryside kept its hallway lights on throughout the night. A former Luftwaffe officer noted, "In Germany, a lamp lit at midnight was grounds for arrest. Here they illuminate the void." Electricity, more than any weapon, has become a symbol of American power. Invisible, silent, uninterrupted. She revealed not only technical ability, but confidence. It was the opposite of what the Germans had been experiencing since 1939. Severe rationing, daily blackouts, streetlights turned off, entire cities in the dark to avoid bombing. Germany feared the light. America distributed it as public policy. The Hereford camp, for example, had an independent electrical network, emergency generators, a perimeter lighting system, and control panels maintained by civilian electricians. The kitchen worked with electric ovens. The makeshift hospital had constant white light, allowing surgeries at night, and the poles planted at regular intervals did not tremble. They were made of galvanized steel, standardized in height, with shielded transformers and weekly maintenance. This pattern was alien in the eyes of the prisoners. Germany, especially in rural areas and on the Eastern Front, still relied on kerosene lamps and makeshift wiring. Power lines were cut by saboteurs, storms, or simple mechanical failures. In many German bunkers, electricity was rationed by schedules. In the US, it was constant, silent, banal, and that was the most offensive. The banality of electricity, of light that does not need to be asked for, has become an unbearable metaphor. One prisoner wrote, "They light everything up like there's no tomorrow." Another, more incisive, "Their light is not just energy, it's ideology." And it was. The American electric system, powered by dams, coal, natural gas, and a growing interstate distribution network, operated with calculated efficiency. In 1943, the United States produced about 140 billion kilowatt-hours, while Germany did not reach a third of that. In the middle of the war, the Americans were expanding their electricity grid, connecting even the most remote areas. Farms received new poles through the Rural Electrification Administration program, a federal initiative that brought power to areas without access, even in times of total war. This decision, to enlighten the forgotten, contrasted sharply with the policy of sacrifice imposed by the Reich. Germany was shutting down entire cities to supply military factories. The United States lit up farming villages to maintain normalcy. It was as if the whole country was saying, "We are at war, but we will not stop functioning." And it worked. Electricity powered the munitions factories, the aviation fuel refineries, the slaughterhouses, the shipyards, and the communication centers. But it also kept movie theaters open, home radios on, poles in schools, and heaters in workers' homes. Germany was trying to survive. America was prospering. And this was visible night after night through the window of each prisoner. Many hoped that in time, American reality would reveal its cracks. That chaos would arise on some corner. That abundance was staging. But what they saw, day after day, was consistency. The light didn't blink. The engines did not fail. The shifts were not delayed. And there were no queues. An officer captured during the Tunisian campaign, and who had served as a railway engineer in Bavaria, wrote in a tone of ideological surrender, "We were taught what discipline it was to shout louder. Here, it comes with manuals and underground cables." This finding, as technical as it was philosophical, eroded the basis of National Socialist pride. They had been brought up to believe that Germany was the technological vanguard of Western civilization. But every well-installed electric wire, every streetlight on a country road, every forgotten light bulb in an empty waiting room, coldly belied this. The light was more than energy. It was a message. The American confidence to keep everything going even under global threat said, without words, that war was not its essence. It was just another variable in the system. And for the Germans who built an entire empire on the rhetoric of sacrifice and urgency, this was unbearable. Because there was no tactical response to the light. It could not be refuted or destroyed by arguments. It could only be seen. And each time she was seen, a piece of the prisoner's ideological pride was erased inside. But there was something even more devastating than constant electricity. Something that came packaged, labeled, stacked in warehouses and powered by battery-powered forklifts. Because if the light on was a symbolic insult, what was behind it, the standardization, was the real gear. And it was this gear that they would see on their next visit. A factory where the impossible became routine, where an entire bomber descended from the conveyor belt every 63 minutes. It was in Willow Run, Michigan, that Nazi ideology faced its quietest defeat. There, in front of a hangar that looked more like a city covered in steel, the German prisoners disembarked in a line, escorted but not cornered. They expected to see propaganda. They become production. The Ford plant, built specifically for the war, occupied 3.5 million square meters. Its goal was straightforward, to manufacture the B-24 Liberator bomber. And he did. Every 63 minutes, a complete plane rolled off the assembly line. Not in theory, in practice. 1 per hour, 24 hours a day. The Germans, accustomed to the idea that a bomber was a work of artisanal engineering, built by experts under military supervision, could not conceive of what they saw. Women operating rivets, blacks supervising assembly lines, civilians doing engine tests, and no one screaming. A Luftwaffe lieutenant who had previously inspected Junker's hangars noted, "They have an army without uniforms." It was a war assembly line run by a democracy, and functioning. Prisoners saw conveyor belts carrying entire sections of fuselage, hydraulic robots testing landing gear, overhead cranes driving engines in sync with signal lights. Production didn't even stop for lunch. The shifts took turns with surgical precision. Whereas in Germany, engineers adjusted each bolt by hand, in the US, the bolts were standardized, labeled, stored by code, and distributed on automatic conveyors. And there were stocks. Stacks of wheels, yards of electrical cables, spare propellers, communication radios, exhaust pipes, all numbered, labeled, and ready to use. The prisoners understood at that moment that the war would be won there, not in the trenches, but in the toolboxes. One statistic crossed the minds of many. In 1943 alone, the U.S. produced more than 85,000 combat aircraft. Germany, in the same year, did not exceed 25,000, 3 times less, 3 times slower. If this comparison surprises you, comment below. Logistics wins, because it wasn't steel nor fuel. It was the gear that wouldn't lock, and there was more. On the other side of the assembly line, the prisoners spotted a smaller pavilion where damaged engines were disassembled, inspected, and recycled. Nothing was wasted. The American logic was functional even in failure. Engines with reusable parts were reinserted into the system, tested again, and redistributed in less than 48 hours. American industry wasn't just productive, it was resilient and inclusive. This was perhaps the final stab at the Reich's racial ideology. In that factory, German soldiers saw black women commanding entire sectors. They saw 19-year-olds leading teams efficiently. They saw workers with Italian, Polish, and even German accents, working in perfect coordination, not out of fear, but out of system. No whip, no threat, just process. Democracy, which the Germans had grown to despise as synonymous with weakness and chaos, was making more aircraft, more ammunition, more vehicles, and more ships than any military dictatorship in history. One prisoner engineer commented as he left the pavilion, "They have no race, they have a manual." And this manual was undeniably superior, because it worked. The Willow Run production line was not a monument to technique. It was a cathedral of efficiency. Every detail, from the uniform to the schedule, carried the American faith that collective functioning was the ultimate weapon. The prisoners left in silence. That was not a spectacle. It was humiliation, but it would not be the last. The next revelation would not come from steel, nor from electricity. It would come from paper, from books, from the bulletins, because the Germans were about to discover that, in addition to mass production, the Americans taught their prisoners how to think. What shook the German POWs most were not the colossal ships, the tracked bombers, or the metronome-paced assembly lines. What really destroyed his convictions was routine. The efficient banality of American daily life. One Bavarian soldier, educated on the rhetoric that the West was a colony of propaganda and corruption, wrote bitterly, "They are not deceiving us. They're just living." Upon arriving at the Hereford camp, many expected psychological tricks, staging, ideological manipulation. But what they found were civilian workers with new boots, meals served on time, open schools with children carrying colorful books, civil servants kindly answering simple questions. It was a cruel normality. Every snack served with soda, every pack of cigarettes delivered at the limit of the ration, every doctor who examined a prisoner with technical respect and professional silence. All this was a form of collapse, not ideological, existential, because it revealed with unquestionable force that Germany was not losing the war only on maps. I was missing out on the details. While the Reich announced heroism among ruins, the U.S. calmly delivered stability. A school notebook, found by a prisoner near an agricultural field in New Mexico, became the subject of secret discussion among captured officers. It contained grammar exercises, math problems, and on the back cover, a complete map of the state's railroads. It was sold for pennies and distributed in public schools. An SS officer noted, "They give rail maps to children. We classify them as secret documents." American democracy didn't just produce more, she trusted more. He trusted in order, repetition, predictability. The prisoners saw it even in silence, the silence of machines that didn't choke, of shifts that didn't complain, of kitchens that didn't delay. It was a world that didn't scream to work, and that was the biggest offense. The absence of fear. Nazi propaganda, which warned so much of the moral collapse of the West, had omitted the most essential, that true power lies in predictability, and the prisoners were immersed in it. The clothes they received were washed by civilians with scented soap. The makeshift libraries in the camps featured classic books, technical translations, newspapers, and even novels. Officers could apply for courses in agronomy, engineering, basic English, not by indoctrination, by structure. American normalcy worked even with the enemy, and this destabilized the internal axis of any belief. What they had learned in the German academies was that power came from strength, sacrifice, ideological purity. But there, in front of clean curtains and punctual trains, they began to see that the real power came from constant running, a machine that doesn't stop, even when its operators disagree with each other, a model of society that, even if imperfect, distributes dignity as a policy. One prisoner wrote, "The greatest American propaganda is the silence with which they live well." And this silence began to creep in the letters, in the looks, in the small routines they imitated. Some began to get up on time, line up their clothes, arrange their beds, not by order, by absorbed habit, because that made sense. The humiliation, therefore, did not come in explosions. It came in gentle steps, in the way a mail truck always arrived at 9, in the way the light came on at 6 in the afternoon, in the way a civilian lady in charge of the laundry smiled as she returned an ironed shirt. Each banal gesture carried an invisible but overwhelming logic, and it was at this point that many understood that the Reich could not win, because he was fighting against a moral gear that did not depend on speech, only continuity, and this continuity now had a name, a face, one system. But there was still one last pillar to fall, the deepest, the most symbolic. Because what the prisoners were about to discover was that even the re-education of the enemy was done with books, not with shouting. And that, in the United States, even ideas were distributed in series. In the weeks following the landing and adaptation to the American camps, a new sound began to circulate among the German prisoners. It wasn't the squeaking of boots or the clinking of cutlery in the cafeteria. It was the muffled sound of voices in a lower, slower tone, the sound of doubt. For the first time, the soldiers of the Reich began to talk to each other not about flight, nor about victory, but about American logic. What they had seen until then could no longer be reduced to propaganda. The factories existed, the treadmills worked, the warehouses were full, the children smiled, and the civilian workers, white, black, female, seemed not only efficient, but satisfied. This deeply wounded the imagination that had been built for them. A Wehrmacht officer wrote, "We were taught that the West was a degenerate mass, corroded by freedom, but there is no sign of weakness here. There is rhythm, there is order, There is progress. The initial reaction was denial. This is a facade, some said. They want to impress us. But the evidence did not yield. It was impossible to sustain the thesis of staging when everything happened before his eyes every day, without effort, without theater. It was a staging that was repeated in multiple states at different times, with different operators. It was a standardized routine, something that the Germans themselves used to associate with the German technical ideal. One imprisoned engineer, who had previously worked for Heinkel, coolly analyzed, "It's not propaganda, it's a process, and it's bigger than any of us." This lucidity began to spread like a slow fever. The groups that were previously organized by ideological affinity began to divide by technical affinity. Those who still defended National Socialism became caricatures, ridiculed not by American soldiers but by their own cellmates. A sergeant in the Afrika Korps, known for his fanatical loyalty, attempted to lead a Mein Kampf reading session at the Papago Park camp. Only 2 attended. A month later, the book had been replaced by a manual of American automotive mechanics. The ideological conversion was not sudden. She was methodical, fed by statistics, by the absence of collapses, by the presence of normality. It was difficult to defend the doctrine of blood and soil when you watched a black farmer in the middle of Texas operating a new tractor efficiently, when it was read in the newspapers that the production of Sherman tanks had exceeded 50,000 units, when it was realized that women not only worked in factories, but led entire teams. The Reich said that chaos would come from equality, but what the prisoners saw was order. Order without fear. Order without punishment. And that was morally devastating. An artillery captain wrote, "The Americans have discipline without brutality. They have productivity without shortage. They have freedom with hierarchy. What do we have left?" What remained, in fact, was reflection, and this reflection began to occupy the idle hours of the fields. Groups met to debate, not as resistance, but as learning. They discussed rural electrification, food packaging methods, interstate transportation of parts. Some wrote theoretical projects, trying to adapt American ideas to the German model. Others admitted the German model was doomed because it had never understood the power of decentralization. The irony was inevitable. The country that had been derided as a degenerate racial jungle was, in practice, an organized colossus. And Germany, which proclaimed itself a beacon of Western civilization, now seemed like an authoritarian experiment doomed to exhaustion. The real strength, the prisoners realized, came not from ideology, but from the ability to function at all levels, even in war. Moral awakening did not erase the crimes, nor did it redeem the guilty, but it showed that the truth could be more destructive than any bomb, and that the greatest threat to the Reich doctrine did not come from Washington. It came from within, from the very silence of those who now, captives, looked across the fence and saw what they once considered impossible, a system in which power was distributed, and yet it was absolute. And if American industry could produce more airplanes, more food, and more light, what was she able to do with the mind of a defeated soldier? That was the question that began to circulate in the fields, and the answer would come, not with steel, but with paper, because the next step in the collapse would be even more symbolic, the moment when the enemy would be invited to study. In the heart of Texas, German POWs expected to find what had been described to them as American rural decay, unproductive land, lazy peasants, ineffective mechanization. What they saw, however, was the opposite, and devastating. A landscape rhythmed by huge tractors, autonomous harvesters, rotating irrigators powered by electric generators, perfectly aligned fields, where rows of wheat grew in sync with the calendar and not with luck. The American countryside, which the Reich doctrine called decadent, proved to be a more impressive cog in the wheel than many German factories. A Caterpillar Model D6 tractor, operated by a single man, covered acres at a speed and depth unattainable by the manual methods still employed in East Prussia. The contrast was brutal. In Bavaria, 70% of farms were still dependent on animal power in 1940. In the United States, more than 80% of large plantations were already operating with mechanical traction. The engine had replaced the muscle, and it produced more with less. One prisoner, a former farmer from the Koblenz region, wrote, "With such a tractor, the war would have ended in a month." American agricultural technology was not only potent, it was omnipresent. Tractors, seeders, harvesters, Irrigation tanks and storage systems formed an ecosystem of uninterrupted efficiency. While Germany struggled to feed its urban population with rations, Americans exported meat, wheat, and corn even in the midst of all-out war. A Wehrmacht quartermaster officer incredulously noted the existence of automatic silos with humidity and temperature sensors, something unimaginable for German manual structures. American agriculture functioned as a constantly expanding logistics chain. A field harvested in the morning was replanted in the afternoon. A herd slaughtered in Iowa was processed, packaged, and shipped to Europe in a matter of days. And all this under civilian control, without the involvement of troops, without militarization of production. The American agricultural machine was, in itself, a strategic weapon. But for the prisoners, it was something even more disturbing, a direct affront to the ideological base that had shaped them. The agrarian ideology of National Socialism, the myth of blood and soil, taught that the German peasant was the soul of the nation, that the bond between man and earth was sacred. That mechanized and urban agriculture weakened the national spirit. However, what they saw in the Texan camps was the opposite. Simple men, often without any ideological training, mastering machines that multiplied their capacity by dozens of times. Earth and machine integrated in harmony, not as decay but as potency. An SS lieutenant, indoctrinated since the 1930s in the German Peasant League, remarked, "Our ideologues fought against the bulldozer. Here the tractor won." And in fact, it won. Prisoners witnessed rows of machines waiting for automatic refueling, workers in clean uniforms and meals ready, warehouses organized with spare parts and labeled lubricants. The American camp was an outpost of planning, not improvisation. It was a system, not a village. In one of the agricultural camps where prisoners were assigned to farm work, the Germans saw something they would never forget: young women operating high-yield harvesters, while teenagers coordinated the flow of transport trucks. There was no arrogance, no brutality, just functioning. Agriculture was not a symbol of sacrifice. It was a sign of technical dominance, and this dominance was multiplied by electricity, industrial maintenance, and above all, predictability. American soil produced because it was treated as part of the war machine, silent, constant, uninterrupted. And the greatest irony, the United States was able to feed allies, soldiers, and even its prisoners with what its agriculture generated as a surplus. Abundance was not a goal. It was a byproduct. If this finding seems absurd to those who lived under scarcity, it is worth remembering that in 1943 alone, the U.S. produced more than 1 billion bushels of wheat. Germany, even though it controls occupied territories in the east, has not been able to exceed 500 million. A difference that was not only measured in tons, but in safety, morale, and strategy. If this comparison surprises you, comment below. Wheat is power, because for the Germans, seeing a country that could afford to feed the world while fighting across 2 oceans was the ultimate proof that they had underestimated not only American industry, but their land. In the Reich, hunger was a constant ghost. In the interior of the United States, food was stored, canned, frozen, and shipped as logistical ammunition. The American farmer was not a folk hero. He was a technical worker, part of a system that understood that to feed is to win. And in the face of this, the prisoners began to understand that the real strength did not come from the boots or the flags. It came from the soil, when mechanized, rationalized, coordinated. But there was still a final component that would break the link between doctrine and reality, because it was not enough to produce more. It was necessary to think differently. And that's exactly what the Americans planned to do next: change the enemy's mind with schools, not interrogations. For the German prisoners accustomed to the rigid racial hierarchy of the Reich, the greatest contradiction was yet to come. It would not come from the factories nor from the crops. It would come from the people. On Ford's assembly lines in the cotton fields of Mississippi, on the docks of New Orleans, it was impossible to ignore who really supported the backbone of the American economy. Women in helmets, black men with clipboards, immigrants with mixed accents operating precision machinery. Nazi doctrine taught that these figures were inferior, biologically, morally, spiritually, but the eyes did not lie. One prisoner wrote, "The tallest crane in Baltimore Harbor is operated by a black man, the most precise by a woman." That was no exception. It was the standard. At the Douglas aircraft plant, Where many prisoners served on temporary duty, more than 40% of the workforce was made up of women. At the Richmond shipyard in California, it was black workers who led the welding of hulls and naval structures. Production didn't just flow, it outperformed Germany's by all indexes. By 1944, the United States employed more than 8 million women in the war industry, while Germany was reluctant until the last year of the conflict to mobilize its citizens outside the home. Ideology had become an obstacle to its own efficiency, and the prisoners were facing the test. If this difference surprises you, comment below. Shocking data, because that was the statistic Nazi officials never imagined they would have to face. The so-called American weakness, miscegenation, democracy, women's freedom, was literally winning the war with screwdrivers and rivets. A German officer, with an experience in industrial design, was recorded saying, "They use everybody, and they make it all work." How to defeat this? This was the question that echoed among those who once fervently defended the ideal of racial purity. Every crane operated by an African American, every conveyor belt controlled by a Polish immigrant, every boiler supervised by a young woman without a rank, was a living refutation of the entire ideological engineering of the Third Reich. Work was divided based on function, not origin, and this not only did not lead to collapse, it increased efficiency. The American system saw no color, via competence, and that was what made him so dangerous for those who had bet everything on exclusion. The most symbolic came from a camp near Helena, Arkansas, where prisoners were placed to unload farm trucks. The driver, a black man in his 50s, commanded the pace, gave orders clearly, organized the load precisely. No officer supervised him. One Waffen-SS prisoner commented bitterly, "In Germany he would not have the right to speak. Here, it commands a better operation than our front-end logistics." That was more than irony. It was moral demolition. Because it showed that institutionalized racism was not just wrong, it was inefficient. And the war, above all, was a contest of efficiency. America didn't care about purity. He worried about delivery. Every ship launched into the sea, every plane that took off, every can of ration that arrived intact at the front was the result of different hands. And this diversity was the true superiority, because he worked without guilt, without doctrine, without fear. The Reich, with all its obsession with control and purity, had lost the ability to adapt. And at that point, the prisoners knew. The future didn't belong to the lined uniforms. It belonged to the grease-stained overalls and the moving cranes. The greatest threat to Nazi ideology was not a bomb. It was a factory with workers they called subhumans, delivering more than the entire trained Aryan elite. But the final blow was yet to come, because prisoners wouldn't just watch this system work. They would be invited to study it, to sit at desks, reading books, discussing ideas, and many would accept it, not by imposition, but by logic. Because the next American offensive would be done with notebooks, not rifles. The Reich still believed that it would win with heroes. He bet on charismatic generals, on symbolic battles, on tanks that paraded like cavalry from the last century. It was a war shaped by the romantic memory of World War I. Trenches, honor, sweat, and personal sacrifice. But the United States, far from the fields of Normandy or the African deserts, had redesigned warfare in another language, the language of the machine. For the German prisoners who had contact with Ford's Willow Run facility in Michigan, the experience was more disturbing than any interrogation. There, a single factory was churning out B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate bordering on the absurd, a full plane every 63 minutes. From the receipt of parts to the delivery to the track, the production line worked without pause, without improvisation, without delay. It was a spectacle of precision, fueled by thousands of workers, rotating shifts, absolute standardization, and a logistical system that connected dozens of states in sync. An 18,000-piece bomber mounted as if it were an appliance. For the Reich engineers, this was inconceivable. Germany still depended on decentralized factories, vulnerable to bombing, with artisanal production lines and logistics in ruins. An airplane like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 could take more than 1,000 hours of human labor to complete. The American B-24s, even at 3 times the weight, went out in chains, 24 a day on average just at Willow Run, and the Germans knew it. A technical officer captured in 1944 stated bitterly, "While we were discussing which screw to use, they were already delivering the plane." The comparison was humiliating. The Nazis extolled quality, but could not keep up with quantity. And the battlefield was no longer the only judge. The real combat took place between tons of steel, liters of fuel, engine hours, meters of track. The war had become mathematical, and the math was American. In 1943, the United States produced more than 86,000 military aircraft. Germany, just over 25,000. And this difference was not compensated by quality or efficiency in use. It was the difference between supplying all fronts and choosing where to fight. The Luftwaffe began to fly less, not for lack of pilots but for lack of planes, parts, kerosene. Meanwhile, American bombers crossed the Atlantic, fueled, escorted, mass-manufactured, and not just planes. The same logic applied to trucks, jeeps, locomotives, ships, ammunition, boots, radios, and uniforms. Every element of the war was multiplied. Victory would not come from a general in Berlin. It would come from a reactor in Pittsburgh, from a press in Chicago, from a sewing machine in Detroit. To the prisoners, this was a bitter revelation. They had been taught that Germany possessed the best tanks, the best officers, the best engineers. And maybe it was true. But the U.S. Army didn't have to be the best. He needed to be the greatest. And it was. In 1944, while Germany was barely able to replace its destroyed divisions, the United States was sending an average of 1,200 tons of supplies per hour to the European front. The front line was fed by rails, by ships, by warehouses, by spreadsheets. The excitement had come out of the war. The calculation remained. The prisoners saw this coldly. GMC CCKW trucks rolled in endless columns. Every numbered piece, every mapped destination. The Nazi cavalry's romantic warfare had been replaced by a conveyor belt with tires, and that made sense. Panzer IV tanks were outnumbered in the field by inferior M4 Shermans, but 5 times as numerous. German engineering spent months to refine a Tiger. The American industry preferred to deliver 6 Shermans ready. In the end, the result was the same. A battlefield taken over by green vehicles, pushing the enemy with the logic of mass production. The prisoners began to understand that they had been taught to fight in a war that no longer existed. And the cruelest thing was to know that his superiors knew this. German intelligence had data on American production since 1942, but he preferred to ignore it. He preferred to believe that a motivated elite would suffice. And it was not enough. The war was no longer about courage. It was tonnage. If this statement impresses you, remember, while the Luftwaffe struggled to supply its squadrons with synthetic fuel, the Allies had, in France alone, more than 900,000 barrels of gasoline stockpiled in July 1944. The difference was not only strategic, it was ontological. A war made by machines, maintained by machines, won by machines. And these machines spoke English. But the greatest machine had not yet been shown to the prisoners. The system that transformed thought into production. Because the next stage would not deal with screws but with ideas. What the Germans discovered next was that the real American weapon was not the factory. It was the mind that drew it. When the winter of 1944 arrived in the American prison camps, many German soldiers expected the cold to bring with it the harsher face of the enemy. They were prepared for scarcity, for negligence, for revenge. But what they received was a coat, a clean blanket, and for some, a letter. In many fields there was a Christmas choir. In others, decorated trees. In almost all of them, packages, sent by families, churches, and civil institutions, containing cigarettes, sweets, books in German, soaps. It was December. And even in war, the United States had decided to treat the enemy as a human. For prisoners trained in the doctrine of hatred and superiority, this was a bewilderment. The American re-education program did not consist of brainwashing or forced indoctrination. It was more subtle and more effective. It included access to local newspapers, films with subtitles, history and geography lessons, moderate discussions about democracy and economics. The more educated could ask for specific books. The less literate learned English from civilian volunteers. What seemed to be a soft strategy was, in practice, a moral offensive. The message was clear. We can defeat you without destroying you. And this was, perhaps, the greatest humiliation. At Fort Robinson Camp, Nebraska, a group of prisoners were treated for pneumonia in a military hospital with resources that most German civilian hospitals lacked: X-rays, antibiotics, individualized care. No difference between an American soldier and a German prisoner. The Geneva Convention was respected not as a limit but as a minimum basis. In many cases, it has been overcome. American doctors, civilian nurses, soldiers of the Guard, all participated in a routine that seemed to belong to another world. The prisoners' accounts show the impact of this daily life. It was not fear that transformed them. It was the comparison. In Germany, they knew that Russian prisoners starved, that the French worked as slaves, that Poles died without trial. They had participated or closed their eyes. But there, in the heart of the United States, they discovered that a system could be strong without being cruel. A guard at Camp Mexia in Texas learned German just to talk to the inmates better. A volunteer teacher, a veteran of the First World War, patiently taught philosophy to young Nazis, and in an almost symbolic gesture, many local churches sang hymns in German during Christmas, so that prisoners would not feel forgotten. It was not naive compassion. It was strategy, but it was also civilization, and that hurt. One prisoner wrote, "If we are the superior people, why are we learning humanity from the enemy?" The U.S. Army understood that war wasn't just about territory. It was about ideas. The logistics of compassion were part of the victory. It was not a question of weakness, it was a demonstration of complete mastery. Military, industrial, and morale. Even entertainment was managed. Chaplain films, news programs with translations, newspapers with editorials about democracy. The reality of the war was not hidden, but he didn't manipulate himself either. The prisoners had access to facts. They could compare, and they compared. American culture was open, confident, plural. Nazi propaganda had taught that the United States was decadent, dysfunctional, run by Jews and blacks. But the reality was different. It was one of order, of security, of abundance, and above all of respect. The most profound blow came with the discovery that many of these gestures came from ordinary civilians, women who cooked extra bread and sent it to the fields, children who wrote holiday letters, churches that organized choirs and services in German. It was not the government, it was the people, and that made it all the more devastating, because it revealed a social strength that Germany no longer possessed. Nazi ideology had erased empathy from everyday life. The American, even in war, maintained her integrity. A camp commander, a veteran of Verdun, declared, "The civilization that sings to its prisoners does not fear its enemies." And he was right. The prisoners did not know how to react. Some revolted in silence. Others wrote letters to their parents, trying to explain the inexplicable. And some slowly began to dismantle the certainties that had brought them there. Because the force was not only in the bombers, in the ships, in the factories, it was in being able to take care of those who had killed their children without becoming equal. And what the United States did next proved that even the reconstruction of the enemy had been planned, because at the end of the war the prisoners would return to Germany, and they would no longer be the same. They had been defeated, but not humiliated. They had been defeated, but taught, and many would carry this until the last day. But history still reserved one last humiliation for Nazi ideology, discovering that, even free, these men would take home a model that defied everything they had sworn to protect. On the night of December 24, 1943, hundreds of German prisoners of war, still wearing Reich uniforms, sat at long tables in barracks, decorated with garlands, candles, and handmade flags. The smell was of roast turkey. Dessert, an apple pie served hot, was accompanied by fresh coffee and restrained laughter from guards and cooks. The camp, located in Hereford, Texas, housed soldiers captured in Tunisia, men who, months earlier, had sworn allegiance to the Führer and the Staggered Cross. Now faced with a meal that his own compatriots no longer received at home, they faced silence. There was no speech. There was no anthem, just music, and a disconcerting sense of involuntary belonging. In several camps in the United States, Christmas was celebrated with prisoners. Local churches sent handwritten cards. Children participated in choirs in German. American families, who had lost children in the Pacific or Italy, donated food and clothing. It was not about forgiveness. It was about civilization. While Germany sank into despair, America offered pumpkin pie to its enemies. It was a gesture that, from the perspective of Nazi propaganda, bordered on madness. But there, at that unlikely supper, many Germans felt something that their own homeland had extinguished: faith. And not faith as doctrine, but faith as human feeling, faith in the possibility of a world that does not need to crush to win. One of the prisoners, a former Wehrmacht captain, would later write, "It was not the force that broke me, it was generosity." The moral impact of that Christmas would echo for decades. There was a symbolic wound that opened up there, not caused by pain but by comfort. They had been taught that America was decadent, irreligious, dominated by liberal chaos. But they found, at the most sensitive moment in the Christian calendar, a gesture that Germany itself had forgotten how to offer: hospitality. In times of all-out war, the United States did not allow itself to lose its moral identity, and that made all the difference. Many prisoners offered to help clean up after supper. Others wrote emotional letters to their families, narrating what they had experienced as if it were a dream. One of them reported, "Here, our enemies treat us as Christians. In Germany, they treated us like tools." The paradox was unbearable. The Reich had hijacked Christian symbols, crosses, values, rhetoric, but emptied them of meaning. In the American fields, these symbols came back to life. There were no crusades, no ideological sermons. There was silence, compassion, and hot food. And this was more destructive to Nazi ideology than any bomb dropped on Berlin. America's strength was not just in the factories. It was in his ability to keep humanity intact even at the height of the war. And this humanity was an invisible, but powerful, weapon. It was what turned enemies into witnesses. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them all along. The Nazis sought power in tanks, race, and discipline. But the real power, that which transforms, that which endures, was on that Christmas table, between guards who served more coffee and prisoners who, for the first time, didn't know what to hate. If you are enjoying unraveling these real stories, where power is revealed in gestures and not in shouts like this video, and subscribe. Their support allows us to continue telling narratives that the war tried to bury. Because what happened that Christmas was not a miracle. It was a choice, and a silent message. Winning is not humiliating. And the greatest humiliation for the Reich would come later, when these prisoners returned to Germany and told them that the enemy had finally given them back their faith. But there was more to be seen. Because not everything was a gesture. Some truths, harder than steel, still waited between the lines of the reports. And the next revelation would come from where the regime least expected it, from the written word. In early 1944, a group of prisoners recently transferred to a camp in Arkansas were told that they could attend weekly lectures on a variety of topics: economics, politics, history, natural sciences. The news was met with skepticism and mistrust. To many it seemed like just another American attempt at indoctrination, but what they found surprised even the most hardened. Volunteer professors, some from universities like Stanford, Harvard, and Chicago, willing to teach, not convert. There was no ideological catechism. There was logic, numbers, evidence. The topics ranged from parliamentary systems compared to the productive structure of the automobile industry. A class on war economics revealed, to the astonishment of the prisoners, that American production of consumer goods had grown even during the conflict. A Luftwaffe officer quietly commented, "They did not sacrifice the people, they reorganized the system." It was the first time that many Germans had access to concepts such as balance between capital and labor, freedom of the press as a pillar of oversight, and the idea that science serves not only the state, but society. The libraries of the camps began to be frequented with increasing frequency. Books on liberal economics, technical engineering manuals, works of modern political philosophy, all available. Prisoners could debate, write, even set up internal newspapers. One of these periodicals, called Die Brücke, carried editorials as early as 1944 that defended the need for an open Germany, not subject to fear. American universities, with the support of the War Department, understood that the deepest war was for the future. If Nazism was a thought control project, the American response would be the opposite: to give the enemy freedom to think. There was no surveillance over the content. There was no censorship about the doubts. And that, for many, was more disturbing than any punishment. When watching a movie about the Great Depression, a group of prisoners expected to see heroism or nationalism. What they saw was criticism, pain, unemployment, protests, displayed by Hollywood with brutal freedom. That was disconcerting. Public institutionalized self-criticism was unthinkable in Reich Germany. In the camp's theaters, prisoners watched John Ford's The Grapes of Wrath. They left in silence. One wrote, "They don't hide their flaws, and that's why they don't repeat them." In lectures on modern physics, they discovered the theory of relativity, banned by the regime for being Jewish science. In seminars on sociology, they were exposed to the idea of the social contract, the role of minorities, the protection of individual freedoms. Those classes, often conducted by war veterans with academic backgrounds, did not seek to convince. They sought to show, and that was the real threat to Nazi ideology: exposure to the truth without filters. Some fields even created book clubs, others, short technical courses, preparing prisoners for post-war life. By the end of 1944, more than 30,000 Germans had participated in some kind of educational program on American soil, and the effects were profound. One prisoner wrote to his father, "Now I understand why they produce more, because they are not afraid to make mistakes, because they can discuss." The cognitive transformation was silent but devastating. If American steel crushed armored divisions, American education dismantled convictions. The Nazi doctrine, based on absolute truths, did not stand up to questioning. The power of the United States was visible in the factories, in the ports, on the rails. But it was even more rooted in libraries and classrooms, because a system that allows its citizens, and even its prisoners, to think freely, builds not just weapons, builds ideas. Intellectual freedom, treated by the Reich as weakness, proved to be the true source of strength, and that was what many prisoners would take back home. Not just the memory of food or comfort, but the discovery that the world could be organized in another way. That blind obedience was not a virtue, and that doubt, the one they feared so much, could be the beginning of something better. Germany, at the end of the war, would face its physical destruction. But what would come next, the reconstruction of his soul, would begin there, in the pages of a book read in silence by a prisoner of war, in some forgotten camp in the American countryside. And there was still one last element missing to complete the humiliation and redemption, the return home. Because what awaited these men when they returned was not glory. It was the silence of what they saw and the responsibility to tell it. In April 1945, when American newspapers began to circulate through the prison camps, the atmosphere changed. The headlines didn't just celebrate the nearness of the end of the war, they revealed something deeper, more abysmal. Dachau had been released, Buchenwald exposed, Bergen-Belsen open. The images arrived in waves, bodies piled up, empty eyes, ovens, mass graves. At first, many prisoners refused to believe it. They called it montage, propaganda, Western exaggeration. The mind, still attached to the idea of the honor of the German army, refused the possibility that it was real. But then came the letters. More well-connected officers received mail from home, with bitter confirmations. The horror was true. Words were becoming scarce in the fields. Soldiers who for years had prided themselves on German discipline began to walk with their heads bowed, avoided looking into the eyes of American guards, and, for the first time, asked that the loudspeakers not play music. Guilt hung in the air, dense, untouchable. The conviction of racial, moral, and spiritual superiority disintegrated in the face of the evidence that the regime itself, the one they had served, was capable of the unthinkable. The reports coming from the death camps didn't just destroy the image of the Reich, they destroyed the image that soldiers had of themselves. The German soldier was trained to obey, but he was never prepared to discover that his obedience fueled hell. The elders cried in silence. The younger ones just stared at the ground. In a camp in Colorado, a group of prisoners organized a silent service. Not a word was spoken. They lit candles, and they stood up. One of them, a former Waffen-SS officer, wrote in his diary, "We were deceived, but we were also complicit. We will never be the same again." The discovery of the crimes of the Reich was not just an informational blow, it was a moral amputation. America, once seen as an enemy of order and faith, came to represent everything that the Germans believed they had defended: civilization, dignity, justice. The weight of this inversion was unbearable, because now it was no longer possible to hate the enemy. It was necessary to hate oneself. In the camps, requests for access to books, newspapers, and testimonies have increased. They wanted to understand. They needed to rebuild what had been dismantled inside them. Many reported difficulty sleeping. Others stopped eating for days. It wasn't hunger. It was shame. The shame of having fought for a lie. One of the prisoners even wrote a letter to the American command, asking that he be allowed to help rebuild the concentration camps after the end of the war. The letter was archived, but it served as a symbol. There, in that gesture, was the confession of a generation. The defeat was no longer military. It was spiritual. Germany had lost tanks, planes, and cities. But what those men lost in the camps of the United States was peace of mind. Because true surrender does not occur when the flag is lowered. It occurs when one loses the reason to fight. And that's what the United States achieved, not only to win the war on the battlefield, but to prove, with facts, images, and freedom, that it was on the right side of history. The American machine of steel, oil, and production was unbeatable, but his most lasting triumph was moral. Because when the enemy acknowledges his guilt without coercion, when he writes letters of apology without being forced, when he asks to learn from whom he has won, then it is not just a matter of victory, it is about redemption, and this is the most difficult terrain to conquer. The war for those prisoners did not end on the day of official surrender. It ended there, in front of the photographs of Auschwitz, the names on the lists of deportees, the ashes, and in the face of the silence that took over the American barracks, a silence that did not ask for explanations, just memory. But there was still one last journey left, the return, because what these men would encounter as they crossed the Atlantic back home would be more devastating than any field, a ruined homeland, waiting for answers, and many of them brought something they never imagined carrying, the truth. In 1946, ships began to cross the Atlantic again, but now in reverse. The same men who had landed in America as defeated soldiers, eyes suspicious and doctrine intact, now returned in silence. The Germany they found was not the one they had left. Cities in rubble, twisted tracks, fragmented families. The Reich had disappeared, and with it, the illusion of greatness built on myths. But inside those former prisoners, there was something that had endured. They had seen the other side work, and more than that, they had understood why. In the years to come, a surprising number of these men would become a vital part of the German Renaissance. Engineers who studied American assembly line methods would reorganize factories. Farmers would transform cooperatives inspired by the mechanization they observed in Iowa's fields. Teachers who attended makeshift classes in the prison camps would be responsible for the new democratic pedagogy in Bonn's schools. And many would become local politicians, infrastructure managers, production chiefs, all with a new obsession: efficiency with dignity. One of the most notable examples was that of Franz Oppenberg, a former quartermaster officer, captured in Tunisia and held for 2 years in Texas. Upon his return, he applied the logistics principles he learned at a Ford plant to reorganize transportation in Bremen. Less than a decade later, his city became an industrial export hub, and he himself would declare in an interview with Radio Bavaria, "America did not defeat me. She taught me to win in a different way." That was the greatest irony. The United States had not only crushed the physical fabric of Nazi Germany, they reconfigured the mentality of some of their soldiers, not by imposition but by exposure. Prison camps have become incubators of the future. It was not propaganda. It was practical. The former prisoners came back with clear ideas about meritocracy, about the value of productive diversity, about how standardization combined with innovation could generate sustainable growth. Many adopted the work as a moral value model, but without the military rigidity, but with the entrepreneurial freedom they had witnessed. It was from this fusion that the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle, would emerge. A miracle that had less of a miracle and more of applied observation. And here, one fact speaks for itself. Between 1949 and 1963, more than 40% of West German industrial managers had been prisoners of war in the United States. It was not a coincidence. It was the direct reflection of a silent learning, which took place outside the books, and inside the workshops, the agricultural fields, the improvised schools. These men had seen a country function with light, food, order, and freedom, and they came back determined to rebuild their own soil with the same pillars. not by copying the United States, but by incorporating what made sense. The idea that the worker should be respected, that profit did not have to come from oppression, that mass production required trust and not terror. This new look would transform German industry. The steel would still come from the mines, but the logic came from Texas. Engineering would still be Germanic, but the pace would be American. The new Germany was born there in the moral shock of defeat, but it flourished because there was learning. And this is perhaps the most powerful lesson of history. True victory is not to humiliate the enemy. It is to transform him. The tracks that had taken those men into captivity in 1943 now led to modern wagons, connecting rebuilt cities. The factories of Bavaria, which had been bombed, now exported to the world. And on the walls of many of them, posters in English could still be seen. Safety first, efficiency always. The American presence persisted, not as an occupier, but as an inspiration. Industrial democracy had won, not only because it produced more tanks, but because it generated more ideas, and because, even in the treatment of the defeated, he remained faithful to principles that, decades later, would be the basis of the reconciliation between two worlds. But there was still something to be said, because among the thousands who returned, some kept diaries, and in them there is a phrase that resurfaces, in different variations, but with the same essence. We were defeated by what we despised, and that is what saved us. The transformation was done, but it remained to be understood definitively what that war had really destroyed, and what it had allowed to be born. The answer would come, not in fleets or battles, but in the silence of the choices made by a new generation. At the end of it all, the rubble remained, but not only those in Berlin, the ideological rubble of a doctrine that promised superiority and delivered ruin. Nazi Germany did fall by force of arms, but it was destroyed above all, by contrast, by the vision of a system that worked, producing freedom and steel at the same cadence. The real collapse came when his captured soldiers, prepared to despise the enemy, found electric light where they expected darkness, abundance where they predicted misery, and dignity where they expected revenge. American industrial power, sustained by rational logistics, unstoppable machines, and a united population, did not just supply the war. He broke the backbone of a belief. Nazism was defeated because it underestimated not only the arsenals, but the idea that efficiency could coexist with decency. And this is where the universal lesson of this story arises. In long wars, the one who shouts the loudest does not win. The one who delivers the farthest wins. Logistics defines the strategy. Scale defeats improvisation. And an assembly line with a constant rhythm is worth 1,000 fiery speeches. Germany had bet on genius and terror. America responded with spreadsheets, shifts, and tractors. As Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, bitterly admitted at Nuremberg, we were defeated by trucks. If you value this research, this search for real facts, and want to see more stories like this, like the video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This helps us to keep historical truth alive. And comment below. What was the most shocking data for you? Steel? Trains? Lights on empty buildings? We want to know. Because the story, when well told, still has the power to surprise. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.